Hello, we're gonna start this timer. I'm gonna try to make this a second short lecture. Oh, you can see my Benadryl and my Diet Coke behind me. 1 second. Sorry. I'm gonna steal that Diet Coke. I'm gonna hide that Benadryl. It is just Benadryl, so whatever. Sometimes I have a hard time sleeping and don't actually have allergy problems and take Benadryl. Maybe I'm an addict, whatever. You guys stop judging me. All right, let's see. Social networks. I'm your teacher, you have to respect me. All right, so let's see here. We are going to cover multi-layer networks, and then we're going to cover multi-level selection in the context of social network statistics and at the end of this lecture. And then I might start the lecture on aggression and dominance hierarchies today. We'll see how it goes. A couple of things. I think next week you're going to have a lecture in, what am I saying? Of course you're going to have lectures next week. Next week you're going to have a test and an exam, midterm, in my class, and that should be between 60 and 75 minutes long. And because there are enough people who have accommodation requirements, I might extend that time to time and a half or double time so that people don't feel rushed for time. But if I can actually figure out how to make special accommodations where specific individuals in the class have different amounts of time available to them, I will. But if not, I'm just going to give everybody double time. So I'd rather give everybody a bunch of charity than accidentally screw someone over. You know what I mean? Anyway, type 1, type 2 error. All right, so the exam will be only multiple choice. Each option will have 5 options. Each question will have 5 options. The TAs, Brendan and Hannah, have been toiling away making these questions for you, and I will add some questions myself. But if you want to blame anyone on how difficult the exam is, you should blame the TAs. It's not. Anyways, don't fret. Please do study. Please make note cards, make detailed notes, rewatch my lectures. I'm trying to make them entertaining for you and informative. And hopefully it won't be too horrible to revisit all of that. By the way, I'm getting a refrigerator in my apartment replaced today. So in the middle of this lecture, we might have a visitor make a lot of noise and try to move a giant instrument into the next room. Anyway, let's see how this goes. Multi-layer networks. So multi-layer networks are basically each network that we've talked about so far, the edges between nodes have represented one kind of interaction, a grooming network or an aggression network or a co-roosting network or a sleeping network of who's sleeping next to each other in a tree or physical contact network. There are a million, or could be a mating network of who's mating with who. Each of those networks would have a set of edges and would have to be depicted separately and analyzed independently up until this moment in time. Multi-layer networks help to solve this issue. So far, one kind of edge, one kind of interaction, each kind of network is separate and analyzed separately. But the problem is that this limits the kinds of conclusions that you'll make and the kinds of solutions you can come up with, and also your general understanding of the system. So if you're just looking at aggression networks, if you're just looking at grooming networks, if you're just looking at mating networks, if you're just looking at physical contact networks, you have an incomplete understanding about all the different ways that individuals are interacting in space, physically, mating, aggression, whatever. So you get an incomplete understanding of the system and you might come to erroneous conclusions. So depicted here are 2 networks. So on the left is a grooming network, it's a hypothetical grooming network, and on the right is an aggression network that's directed. Grooming, we assume it's allo grooming in this instance, or at least we don't know who initiated the grooming event. On the right-hand side, we actually know which, we're gonna say they're female baboons again, beat the crap out of the other individuals. These yellow dots are individuals that are not part of this nuclear social group of pink females here. So they're possibly another matrilineal line. So baboons and lots of other primates have matrilineal societies where all the females of a specific line are basically in a coalition together, and the oldest females are on top of this dominance hierarchy, and her daughters will be immediately below her, and their granddaughters or their daughters, the granddaughter of the original female, is beneath them, and then every individual in that line resides above the next rank of females who are all in a matrilineal society. So matrilineal groups like that are linearly arranged in sequence to determine the dominance hierarchy of matrilineal societies. Anyway, so we're going to pretend like all the females in this group here are within a matrilineal lineage together. So this might be the grandmother, this might be her daughters, and these might be her granddaughters, hypothetically. All right, and so in this case, the size of the node is actually depicts the status of the female and not necessarily her reproductive output like it did before. Anyway, people will tell you in figure legend what the size of the node means. Anyway, so we have this nuclear group of females, and we see that they're interacting with each other in allogrooming regularly. These yellow dots are females that we're not really paying attention to all that much in our study, but we do realize that they're not part of our focal matrilineal group that we're studying. So we look at this allogrooming network, and they're not, our focal females in pink are not allogrooming with these females from other groups, and that makes sense because they're rivals. But if we look at aggression networks, we can see that there's lots and lots of directed aggression occurring from our group to the exterior and not within the group. So there's very little fighting within our matrilineal society, lots of directed aggression to the exterior, both into our social group and from our social group outwards to other females and other lineages, right? Cool. If you're interested in disease transmission, which network do you want to look at? Do you want to look at grooming networks? Well, they're picking off lice from each other or ticks from each other, which can transmit diseases. So maybe we should pay attention to that. But they're also coming into physical contact, and they're coughing, and they could probably transmit like upper respiratory infections or share elements of their microbiota from their skin to between females of the lineage. So maybe you'd want to have a grooming network, or maybe you'd want to have the aggression network, right? If they're like biting each other and they're transmitting saliva, or maybe that would be important for something like rabies transmission, right? So if you only looked at one of these phenomena, and there are labs in the world that only look at grooming, there are labs in the world that only look at aggression. If you only studied one thing, one kind of social interaction, you might infer very different kinds of transmission dynamics, right? So you would say if you were studying grooming behavior, there's a very low chance of transmitting a pathogen from the interior of our social group to females in another matrilineal society, or another, I shouldn't say society, another matrilineal lineage. Versus on the right-hand side here, if you're just studying aggression, you would say that almost all the transmission should be occurring from one group, one matrilineal group to another. So you have a very different sense of who should be transmitting diseases to who, right? Ideally, to have a complete understanding of how diseases would be transmitted, you'd want to have both kinds of information. And then you could say, okay, these are the total ways that individuals are connected within our group and between groups, and the various ways that transmission could occur if we knew something specific about the disease of interest. So where you look and how you look at a problem will change what kinds of solutions you come up with. So going back and let's say that now these females in these social groups are, the size of those circles has to do with their fitness. So on the left-hand side here, we would say that strong levels of bonds of a grooming network are positively associated with greater fitness. Again, we're now switching over to the idea these large circles might mean something like fitness, or they're associated with high ranks, for instance. So if these circles are meant to be high ranks, this female here would have a high rank. It has very strong levels of allogrooming with these other females, right? And this individual that's relatively isolated, and this individual that's relatively isolated, has fewer connections. They tend to be more gaunt and less frequent in their occurrence. But if we were looking at aggression, we might say that fitness or dominance, whichever we decide these nodes size, whatever that will mean, is associated with directed aggression, right? So aggression that occurs from other groups towards these females, our focal females, is associated with depressed status and reproductive output. Our big fat female and the one intermediate female have no directed aggression towards them from exterior members, individuals from beyond the group, versus individuals that have relatively low fitness and social status. These small circles here have a greater incidence of directed aggression towards them from other group members, right? So the question then becomes, is fitness, if that's what these larger circles are implying, or social status, if this larger circles are implying that, is it driven by affiliative networks or is it driven by aggression networks? Well, it's associated with both. And if you only looked at one kind of interaction, you would assume that was what was causing the response variable. Large dominant females or large highly reproductive females, which are probably also correlated with each other as well. High-ranking individuals tend to be more fecund. All right, so multi-layer networks basically attempt to address this issue. So they say that, all right, so first there are giant sorts of organization like cities, and there's meso levels of organization like districts, and then buildings within districts, and then individuals within buildings, and that multi-layer networks need to account for all of these tiers of organization. However, they also need to account for other ways that these buildings are connected, right? Maybe they're connected because they have a shared company, right? Something like a Starbucks might be in many of these districts and might have occur in many of these buildings, and several of these occupants probably work at Starbucks, and others attend Starbucks. Attend Starbucks, it's a school. Anyway, so there are ways that companies connect these things, and mass transit connects these things. And so there are lots of different tiers of organization, from macro tiers to micro tiers. And then there are lots of ways of connecting individuals. Do they share employment? Do they cohabitate in a building? Do they ride on the subway together each day? Are they friends? Are they romantic partners? Are they mating with each other? Do they go to the same nightclubs or bars each night? Now, maybe not each night, but like semi-regularly, right? Anyway, so there's lots of ways that you can have connections. There are lots of ways that you can organize them at different tiers, and multi-layer networks try to account for all of this in sort of a macro multi-layer approach to try to get a more complete understanding of the system and a more complete graphical and analytical description of how societies are organized. Mind you, once you have all that complexity, it becomes hard to depict these things in a way that the human eye can actually identify and follow what's going on. So your intuition becomes less and less reduced as you allow more and more of this complexity to be accounted for in your network. But computers are still pretty good at accounting for all this complexity. At least we're getting better at making computers do that for us. There's some yard work happening outside. I told them that I was filming a lecture this morning, and for them not to be doing it immediately outside the store, but in fact, this window, but they're going to be doing it. So I'm so sorry. I apologize. So presumably we could learn a lot from multi-layer networks. There's multiple tier of organization, there's multiple kinds of interaction, but nobody's actually evaluated with this multi-layer approach anything in behavioral ecology so far. In fact, the ideas papers that just say this could be important were published in the last 2 to 3 years. So hypothetically, if this interests you, you could set up experimental populations of flies right now and have them look at mating interactions and aggressive interactions and aggregations on food and who cohabitates together at night or whatever. And you can actually try to use a multi-layer approach to see whether or not accounting for multiple layers actually helps you predict anything better than a single layer approach would. Presumably it will, but how much benefit will you get? Is it worth the extra time and effort? Nobody knows yet. So case studies, there aren't any. The hypothetical example that people like to throw out there is like the Tokyo mass transit network. Like there are buses and there are subways and there are trains and there are planes. Helicopter pads. And so if you wanted to figure out the fastest way to get from one point to another point in Tokyo as a tourist, say, you would want to have an understanding about all the different ways that these buildings are connected in the mass transit system, right? Take a bus to here, then take a subway to here, and walk here. If you only had one kind of information, if you only knew one way that all of these places were connected using mass transit, you might take an inefficient, for your time, route to get from point A to point B. Same thing could happen in a disease, right? If you knew about all the different ways that these monkeys, these baboons were connected to each other, presumably you could infer how transmission would occur through the social group more effectively than if you only had one kind of social interaction you were accounting for, a single layer network. Multi-level selection. So how your fitness is determined is probably not just a function of your traits, right? Your personality, your body size, your color, your whatever, your weight, your height, but all those other things. It's probably also who's around you and how you're interacting with them. If you have horrible traits, but you're a part of a highly affiliative interaction network with a little local clique that all takes care of each other, presumably you could do quite well. Versus even if you're in fantastic shape, you've got all the best traits in the world, if you're not highly socially integrated, you don't have other individuals around you, or they're treating you poorly, presumably you could do really, really poorly. So in addition to your own traits influencing your fitness, who you're around, your social circumstances, your position in the web work of a society probably influences whether or not you do well or poorly, and which kinds of traits are favored. The kinds of traits that could help you as a loner might screw you if you were trying to work in the high side of a social group. And versus if you were had these traits that would help you in a highly integrated social group, presumably you're forced into being a loner, it could work out quite poorly for you, right? You'd wither, you'd die. So there's also interactions between your social circumstances and your traits that jointly determine combinations of your social circumstances and your traits that determine how you're going to perform. Those are called interaction terms, and you have to account for multiple kinds of forces to predict an outcome. It's not enough to know your height or your color or whatever to figure out whether or not you're going to do poorly or well and in your reproductive output. You have to identify other features simultaneously, like your social position. All right, so social networks have 3 tiers. I mentioned like there's node level statistics and then there's network level statistics. That was kind of a lie, but it was an oversimplification early on. There's also the clique level, and cliques are basically, like you would imagine, like Vendelian clique. You have like a little group of red individuals here, another little clique of yellow individuals here, another little clique of green individuals here. In real life, the cliques are not normally this nice. But these cliques are, and clear, but these cliques are connected to each other from these sort of central node individuals that connect the cliques together into a giant aggregated network. Presumably within a clique, there are more interactions. It's more of a nucleus. It's more like an effective social neighborhood. You're 5 to 10 close friends. Even in New York City, you're only going to know probably like 5 or 10 people as an adult. So like, anyway, even massive networks like that, cliques are very important. And they basically are your social world. Anyway, that was also me deflating the notion that if you feel like you're not highly integrated with other people, that is going to be solved if you go to a big city. Your effective clique size as a human being is basically set. We don't know why, but probably only have so much free time, and it might even be biologically determined. Anyway, so cliques will also have a geometry. They'll be an average clique size. They'll have a certain kind of geometry and interconnectedness. And individuals, therefore, have their own individual statistics, like their degree, how many individuals they're connected to. Their clique can have attributes. And then the number and density of cliques at the level of the network can also be a metric. Individuals that tie cliques together are oftentimes quite important. They can be reconciliatory individuals that help to reduce tension, social tension and conflict once there's been a conflict between cliques, like between matrilineal groups that might be competing with each other for the ascendant position in our dominance hierarchy, which is something that we'll get into in a little bit. They could be super spreaders of disease, right? If it weren't for these meddlesome confluence individuals that help connect these cliques together, a disease would probably stay together in this clique, right? I got the flu, I give it to the people that I'm interacting with socially and romantically, and then it would stop if it weren't for these meddlesome individuals that are hanging out with multiple cliques and they can transmit it from one clique to the next. There would be more restricted cultural and more restricted disease transmission within cliques if it were not for these confluence individuals connecting cliques together. So these confluence individuals help to transmit cultural units or even genetic units from one clique to the next if they're mating with each other along these bonds. But they also tend to transmit things like diseases. So they're helpful in some circumstances and harmful in others, these confluence individuals. So they're oftentimes drivers of cultural change, but also super spreaders in disease transmission networks. And they oftentimes occupy important social roles above and beyond that. The vulturine guinea fowl, nature's most erotic creature. Its face is hideous, but it's got an amazing set of plumage. Wow. So these are guinea fowl, but they're super fancy guinea fowl that live in Central Africa. So individuals have a little social role. They have who they're connected to. They live in these groups that basically move around and forage together. And then these groups actually interact with each other semi-regularly. So here's just a depiction of what these groups look like. We're looking at the dry season spatial distribution of these groups. Within each of these little groups here, little cliques, there are white nodes, which are females, black nodes, which are males. They're organized together in space, and they're organized and they interact with each other along spatial lines, normally when they have to forage with each other. During the dry season, they're relatively discrete. During the wet season, these cliques are interacting with each other a lot. Imagine if your fitness is not just contingent on where you are in your clique, but how regularly your cliques interact with other cliques. Basically, the traits that determine your fitness are beyond your control, and it's very difficult to know how selection navigates such problems because you don't control your clique geometry. You don't control how your clique interacts with other cliques. So how does selection at this higher level of organization, when greater levels of organization determine fitness, what does evolution do in response? Well, it can change group choice decisions, right? Individuals might choose to join some cliques over others, right? Maybe if it's good to be in small cliques, individuals will leave one large clique and move to smaller cliques. Sure. Adaptive fission fusion. If large cliques are bad, they should tend to split up. If large cliques are good, then small cliques should assemble together to make larger cliques. So fission fusion dynamics, the joining and separation of subgroups, should be coincident with how selection is occurring at the clique level, whether it helps big cliques or small cliques or certain kinds of geometries of cliques. Social niche construction. You should try to create social circumstances that are helpful to you, either through group choice, by chasing off individuals from out of your group if they're not desirable, if they're not causing social circumstances that are beneficial to you, or you should try to create social bonds or network positions for yourself within a clique that are advantageous. And lastly, you should exhibit some level of social plasticity. If you're in a situation where your traits and your social circumstances aren't combining to enhance your fitness, then you need to adjust your traits, which are probably the things you can genetically modify the most by epigenetic phenomena. So the last situation here is we're going to talk about a case study with great teats, which are those little passerine birds from England and Central Europe. So again, we have RFID readers that can sense the presence of these birds, and individual birds are taught to solve a problem. Some of these birds are, so they have this little window here, which is on half of it's blue and half of it's red, and some individuals are taught by an experimentalist that in order to get the food inside of these windows, they have to touch the blue side, have to peck at it, and the window will open and they can get some food, and then it closes. But another set of individuals that are thrown out into this population, if they have this training regime, are taught to peck the red side, which then opens the door. And they're only taught one solution. So maybe 10 individuals are taught one, 10 individuals are taught the other solution, and then they get thrown out into the population. And then both solutions actually open the door for every other individual. For these focal individuals that are taught, their RFID tag, when they show up at this little contraption, only allows them to open the door one way. All of the other individuals in the population can open the door either which way. So the question then becomes, other individuals in the population, how do they solve this problem? Any solution, red or blue, would cause the door to open, but does their social network position predict what kind of solution they come up with? Well, we have multiple ways to solve the problem, right? You can peck the blue side, you can peck the red side. The seed individuals only have one solution that they can use. Everybody else can use any solution. But what this study found is that individuals that are highly connected to the seed individuals socially tend to pick up the seed individual solution. So if you're highly connected to an individual that was taught blue is the solution, everyone around them learns to peck the blue side. Even though the red side would have worked for everybody else, they're all picking the blue side. Versus individuals that are other individuals that are not seeded, that were connected to these trained individuals that learned how to peck the red side, they all peck the red side. So we see that there's cultural transmission of how to solve this problem that's determined based on who you're socially integrated with, right? So if you're connected to a seed individual that had the blue solution, everybody's going to learn that blue solution. Individuals that were highly connected to individuals that have a red solution, that red solution proliferates through those cliques and those sub-cliques of this larger network. And these investigators could watch in real time the transmission of this little cultural phenomenon they trained these birds to solve. And even after these seed individuals died, like the next year, their social cultural legacy lived on. The individuals that learned the solution from that seed individual kept that solution with fidelity the next year. And so this shows cultural transmission experimentally in the wild that falls along social network lines. Who you're connected with socially determines what kinds of solutions you produce to novel problems, and that's quite impressive. So quite a neat little study. I hope that was clear to you. All right, so the next lecture will be on territoriality, various kinds of recognition mechanisms, self versus mutual assessment when you're in contests. We'll talk about dear enemies, and then dominance hierarchies, which are sort of an emergent property of animal societies, and then how much information individuals actually know about how strong they are, how weak they are, and where they reside inside of social groups. Are they clueless, or do individuals know exactly how strong or weak they are in a dominance hierarchy? we will hopefully have a better answer to that sometime next week. Anyway, thanks for existing. Thanks for watching my lecture, and hopefully you guys will like this, and we will see you guys next week. And this content coming up next week will be on the exam, so please study. All right. I don't want to stop my share and stop.